On a cold November morning in 1908, Sheriff William Patterson stood at the edge of Margaret Hoffmann's pig farm in rural Indiana, watching as his deputies dug through the muddy pen. The stench was overwhelming, a mixture of animal waste and something else, something that made even the most hardened officers cover their noses. What they were about to uncover would become one of the most horrifying discoveries in American criminal history. 6 wedding rings, all different sizes, all belonging to men who had mysteriously vanished over the course of 16 years. But the rings were just the beginning. What lay beneath the mud and filth would reveal a woman who had turned marriage into murder, and her farm animals into unwitting accomplices in disposing of the evidence. Today, we're going to explore the twisted story of Margaret Hoffmann, the woman who fed her 6 husbands to her pigs, and how she almost got away with it. Before we dive into this dark tale, let me know in the comments if you've heard of any similar cases in your area. And if you're new here, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our investigations into history's most disturbing crimes. Margaret Schultz was born in 1859 in a small German immigrant community outside Fort Wayne, Indiana. Her father, Heinrich Schultz, was a butcher who had brought his trade from the old country, establishing a modest but successful meat processing business. From the age of 7, Margaret was expected to help in the family butchery, learning to wield knives with precision and watching as her father transformed living animals into neatly packaged cuts of meat. Her mother died during the birth of Margaret's youngest sibling, when Margaret was only 8 years old, leaving her to care for 5 younger brothers and sisters, while also working in the butcher shop. By the time she was 14, Margaret could slaughter and process a 300-pound hog faster than most grown men, a skill her father praised as evidence of good German efficiency. But there was something unsettling about the way Margaret approached the work. While her father showed respect for the animals and insisted on quick, humane kills, Margaret seemed to take a different kind of satisfaction from the process. Neighbors would later recall seeing her standing over freshly killed animals, with an expression that could only be described as fascinated, almost pleased. The Schultz family butcher shop operated on the outskirts of town, close enough to serve the community, but far enough that the sounds and smells of slaughter wouldn't disturb the more delicate sensibilities of the townspeople. Margaret spent most of her youth in this blood-soaked environment, becoming intimately familiar with anatomy, with the weight and texture of flesh, with the process of reducing a living creature to its component parts. Her father often remarked that she had a natural talent for the work, though he found it odd that a young woman would show such enthusiasm for what was traditionally men's work. Margaret never showed interest in the things that occupied other girls her age. She had no friends, attended no social gatherings, and rejected every suitor who came calling. Her father worried that she would become a spinster, a burden on the family, but Margaret had other plans. In 1889, when Margaret was 30 years old, her father died suddenly of a heart attack, leaving the butcher shop to his eldest son. Margaret, who had worked in the business her entire life, received nothing. This injustice burned within her, but she said nothing, simply packed her few belongings and left town. She had saved enough money over the years to purchase a small pig farm about 40 miles away, in an even more isolated area, where land was cheap and neighbors were scarce. The 48-acre property came with a 2-story farmhouse, a large barn, and several outbuildings that had fallen into disrepair. Margaret spent the first year alone on the farm, fixing up the buildings, establishing her pig operation, and learning the rhythms of her new life. She started with just a dozen pigs, but she had bigger plans. It was at a church social in the nearby town of Millbrook in 1892 that Margaret met William Carter. William was a widower in his late 40s who owned a successful grain distribution business. He had been alone for 3 years since his wife's death from tuberculosis, and his friends had been encouraging him to remarry. Margaret, now 33, and considered well past marriageable age by the standards of the time, presented herself as a competent, hard-working woman who could be a valuable partner in business as well as in life. William was immediately taken with her practical nature and her knowledge of farming. They married after a courtship of just 3 months, and William moved to Margaret's farm, bringing with him a substantial sum of money that he invested in expanding the pig operation. 2 weeks after the wedding, Margaret convinced William to take out a life insurance policy worth $3,000, a fortune at the time. She argued that it was only prudent, given the dangerous nature of farm work and their lack of children to provide for each other. William Carter lasted exactly 14 months. On November 15, 1893, Margaret told neighbors that William had traveled to Chicago on urgent business. Weeks passed with no word from him, and Margaret began telling people that she feared he had abandoned her for another woman. She played the part of the wronged wife perfectly, garnering sympathy from the community, while also explaining William's absence in a way that discouraged too many questions. People in those days understood that men sometimes simply left, started new lives elsewhere, especially men without children or strong family ties. What actually happened to William Carter was far more sinister. According to notes found hidden in Margaret's bedroom many years later, she had poisoned his evening meal with strychnine, the same poison she used to kill rats in the barn. She described in chilling detail how she had watched him writhe in agony on the kitchen floor, timing his death throes with the mantel clock. It had taken him 3 hours and 17 minutes to die, and she had sat in her rocking chair the entire time, calmly knitting while he begged for help. The disposal of William's body revealed the true depths of Margaret's planning. She had spent months training a select group of pigs, gradually introducing raw meat into their diet, starting with scraps from her butchering and progressively giving them larger pieces. By the time William died, these pigs had developed a taste for fresh flesh. Margaret used her butchering skills to dismember William's corpse, cutting it into manageable pieces that she could carry to the pig pen under cover of darkness. The pigs consumed everything except the largest bones, which Margaret ground up using equipment from her father's butcher shop that she had secretly taken before leaving home. The bone meal was mixed with the regular pig feed over the following weeks. Within 3 days of his death, William Carter had completely vanished, absorbed into the very farm he had helped to expand. Margaret waited a full year before beginning her search for husband number 2, long enough for any questions about William's disappearance to fade, but not so long that people would wonder why a widow wasn't seeking remarriage. She placed advertisements in German-language newspapers across the Midwest, describing herself as a prosperous widow with a successful farm seeking companionship. The ads were carefully worded to attract men with money but few family connections. She received dozens of responses, but she was selective, looking for specific qualities in her victims. They needed to be wealthy enough to be worth killing, isolated enough that their disappearance wouldn't cause immediate alarm, and trusting enough to fall for her performance of the devoted wife. Jacob Muller answered her requirements perfectly. A 52-year-old baker from Milwaukee, Jacob had recently sold his bakery and retired with savings of approximately $4,000. He had no living relatives in America, his parents and siblings having remained in Germany. He was looking for a quiet rural life and a woman to share his remaining years with. Margaret presented herself as exactly what he sought, a mature, stable woman with property and a profitable business. They corresponded for 3 months before Jacob made the journey to Indiana. Margaret met him at the train station in her best dress, playing the part of the eager bride-to-be perfectly. They were married within 2 weeks of his arrival, and Jacob, completely smitten, immediately added Margaret as the beneficiary to his existing life insurance and took out an additional policy at her suggestion. Margaret had learned from her experience with William. This time, she chose arsenic as her weapon, administered in small doses over 6 weeks. To the neighbors who occasionally visited, Jacob's declining health appeared to be a natural illness, perhaps consumption or some other wasting disease common in that era. Margaret played the devoted nurse, tending to him with apparent dedication, bringing him special broths and medicines that she claimed were old family remedies. She even called in the local doctor once, timing the visit for just after she had given Jacob a dose of ipecac to induce vomiting, making his illness appear more legitimate. The doctor, seeing what appeared to be clear symptoms of consumption, prescribed rest and fresh air, never suspecting that he was being used as an unwitting accomplice to murder. Jacob Muller died on August 3, 1896, and Margaret had already prepared for his disposal. She had dug a shallow pit in a section of the pig pen, covering it with hay so it wouldn't be noticed. But this time, she made an innovation in her method. Instead of dismembering the body immediately, she dragged Jacob's corpse to the pen while it was still warm and let the pigs at it directly. She had been training this particular group of pigs for months, gradually increasing the amount of raw meat in their diet, sometimes withholding food for days to make them especially hungry. The pigs fell upon Jacob's body with a ferocity that surprised even Margaret. Within 72 hours, Jacob Muller had been completely consumed, except for his gold teeth, which Margaret carefully collected and later sold to a traveling merchant, who asked no questions. The success with Jacob emboldened Margaret. She had collected on 2 life insurance policies, inherited Jacob's savings, and eliminated all evidence of the crime. The local community saw her as a tragic figure, a woman twice widowed, and their sympathy prevented them from asking too many questions. Margaret used some of the money to further expand her pig operation, building new pens in a secluded area of the property, hidden from view by a grove of trees. She also invested in better equipment for processing meat, telling neighbors she was planning to expand into selling pork products at the regional markets. This gave her a legitimate reason for the increased activity on her farm and the occasional sounds and smells that might otherwise have raised suspicions. By 1898, Margaret had refined her hunting technique to an art form. She no longer placed ads in just German newspapers, but expanded to Swedish, Polish, and Irish publications, casting a wider net for potential victims. She developed different personas for different ethnic communities, adjusting her story to appeal to each group's particular values and expectations. For German men, she emphasized her traditional values and housekeeping skills. For Swedish men, she played up the prosperity of her farm. For Irish men, she presented herself as a woman of faith who attended Mass regularly. She became a master of manipulation, able to read men's desires and present herself as their perfect match. It was through a matrimonial agency in Chicago that she began corresponding with Eric Johnson in early 1899. Eric was a 45-year-old lumber worker from Minnesota who had saved a considerable sum working in the brutal logging camps. He was tired of the hard life and looking to settle down with a woman of means. Margaret's letters to Eric were masterfully crafted, presenting just enough vulnerability to appeal to his protective instincts, while also showcasing her competence and prosperity. She sent him a photograph taken years earlier, when she still retained some of the beauty of youth, and Eric was immediately smitten. What Margaret didn't know when she invited Eric to visit her farm was that he would bring his younger brother, Niels, with him. The arrival of two potential victims instead of one presented both an opportunity and a challenge. Margaret had to quickly adjust her plans, but she saw the potential for an even greater profit. She married Eric in April 1899 and convinced Niels to stay on as a farmhand, promising him wages and a share of the farm's profits. Over the summer months, she played a dangerous psychological game with the brothers. She would show subtle favor to Niels when Eric wasn't watching, then lavish attention on Eric when Niels was around. She created a rivalry between them, each brother believing he was her favorite, while growing increasingly suspicious of the other. By September, the brothers barely spoke to each other, their relationship poisoned by Margaret's manipulations. The murder of the Johnson brothers was Margaret's most ambitious crime yet. She convinced both brothers to take out life insurance policies, using their rivalry to her advantage. She told each brother separately that the policies were to protect him from the other, suggesting that she feared what might happen if something unfortunate occurred. On the night of October 10, 1899, Margaret prepared a special feast to celebrate the harvest. She cooked a massive pork roast with all the traditional fixings, telling the brothers she wanted to celebrate their successful first year together. The meat was laced with enough strychnine to kill several men. Both brothers began showing symptoms within an hour of eating. Margaret locked them in the root cellar, telling them it was for their own protection while she went to fetch the doctor. She then attended the local harvest festival, establishing her alibi while the brothers died in agony in the darkness below her kitchen. Margaret's performance upon returning home with several concerned neighbors was worthy of a stage actress. She screamed when she discovered the bodies, collapsed in apparent grief, and had to be physically supported by the other women. The local doctor, examining the bodies, concluded that the brothers had died of food poisoning, possibly from spoiled meat. It was a tragedy, he said, but such things happened, especially with improperly preserved food. The community rallied around Margaret, the poor woman who had now lost 3 husbands to tragic circumstances. The local women's auxiliary even took up a collection to help her through this difficult time. Margaret accepted their charity with appropriate gratitude, all while calculating how much she would receive from the insurance policies. The disposal of the Johnson brothers' bodies required extra planning due to their size and the fact that there were 2 of them. Margaret had been preparing a special group of pigs for months, keeping them in an isolated pen and training them specifically for this purpose. She had gradually increased their diet of raw meat, while also periodically starving them to increase their aggression and hunger. On the night after the funeral, which had featured closed caskets due to the supposed deterioration of the bodies from food poisoning, Margaret retrieved the brothers' corpses from the temporary storage in her ice house. She had told the undertaker She wanted one more night to say goodbye before the burial, and he had sympathetically agreed. Margaret dragged both bodies to the isolated pen, a considerable physical feat for a woman of 40. But years of farm work had made her remarkably strong. The pigs, which had been deliberately starved for 3 days, fell upon the corpses with a violence that exceeded even Margaret's expectations. The sounds they made, the tearing and crunching, could be heard from the main house. Margaret sat on a stump nearby, watching by moonlight, as the brothers who had loved her were reduced to nothing. Within a week, both bodies had been completely consumed. Margaret spread lime over the pen afterward, telling curious neighbors that she was treating the soil for parasites. By 1901, Margaret had accumulated substantial wealth from insurance policies and her victims' savings. She could have stopped then, lived comfortably on what she had stolen. But something had changed in Margaret. The killing had become more than just a means to money. It had become a compulsion, an addiction. She needed the thrill of the hunt, the satisfaction of watching a man fall under her spell, the power of deciding when and how he would die. She had also become overconfident, believing that her methods were foolproof and that she could continue indefinitely without being caught. It was this overconfidence that led her to make her first real mistake. Thomas O'Sullivan was not the type of man Margaret usually targeted. A former Chicago police detective turned private investigator, Thomas had been hired by Eric Johnson's former employer to investigate the brothers' deaths. The lumber company held a small insurance policy on Eric and needed confirmation of death to collect. Thomas arrived at Margaret's farm in the summer of 1901, but unlike her previous victims, he came with suspicions. He had done his research, discovered that Margaret had been widowed multiple times, and found it curious that all her husbands had died within 2 years of marriage. Thomas presented himself as a potential suitor who had heard about Margaret through mutual acquaintances. He was charming, intelligent, and seemed genuinely interested in her. Margaret, despite sensing something different about him, was intrigued. Here was a man who might be her intellectual equal, someone who could provide a real challenge. She decided to marry him, partly for the thrill of the danger, partly because she believed she could outwit him. They were married in December 1901, and Thomas, believing he was getting closer to evidence, allowed himself to relax his guard. He had found bone fragments near the pig pens that looked suspicious, and he had secretly sent them to a colleague in Chicago for analysis. What Thomas didn't realize was that Margaret had been watching him just as carefully as he had been watching her. She had noticed his late-night explorations of the property, his careful questions about her previous husbands, the way he examined her financial records when he thought she wasn't looking. In February 1902, she intercepted a letter from his colleague in Chicago, confirming that the bone fragments were indeed human. Margaret knew she had to act immediately. On the night of February 20th, she didn't use poison. Instead, she waited until Thomas was deeply asleep and struck him in the head with a hammer, crushing his skull with a single, perfectly placed blow. It was the first time she had killed with her own hands, rather than through poison, and she found it surprisingly satisfying. The disposal of Thomas's body was different from the others. Margaret was angry, furious that he had tried to expose her, and she took that anger out on his corpse. She spent the entire night dismembering him with a savagery that shocked even her. She scattered the pieces across 3 different pig pens, watching as different groups of pigs consumed the man who had nearly brought her down. But Thomas had been more careful than Margaret realized. He had sent regular letters to colleagues in Chicago, documenting his suspicions and his findings. When he stopped writing, when he failed to respond to telegrams, wheels were set in motion that would eventually lead to Margaret's downfall. Margaret knew that Thomas's disappearance would raise questions, so she created an elaborate story. She told neighbors that Thomas had returned to Chicago on urgent business, that he had discovered his former partner had been embezzling funds and needed to handle the situation immediately. She even forged letters from him, sending them to herself and showing them to concerned neighbors. But the investigators in Chicago weren't fooled. They knew Thomas's handwriting, his manner of expression, and these letters didn't match. They began their own investigation, quietly, carefully, gathering information about Margaret and her previous husbands. Despite the danger closing in, Margaret couldn't stop herself from hunting again. In 1905, she found Albert Zimmerman through a German newspaper in Cincinnati. Albert was 61, a retired railroad engineer with substantial savings and a recent inheritance from a deceased brother. He was lonely, having never married, and was looking for companionship in his golden years. Margaret presented herself as a mature widow who understood loneliness, who could offer him comfort and care in his final years. Albert was completely taken in, traveling to Indiana with his life savings and a heart full of hope. Margaret married Albert in the spring of 1906. By now, her routine was well established. Insurance policies were obtained. The slow poisoning began. The community was prepared for another tragedy. She had refined her arsenic dosing to an art, knowing exactly how much to give to create symptoms that mimicked natural illness without causing suspicion. She even brought in a doctor several times, always timing the visits for when Albert's symptoms would appear most consistent with consumption or another wasting disease. The doctor, young and inexperienced, never suspected foul play. For 6 months, Margaret slowly poisoned Albert while maintaining the facade of the devoted wife. She sat by his bedside, reading to him from the Bible, feeding him special broths that she claimed would restore his strength, but which actually contained carefully measured doses of arsenic. She held his hand as he weakened, whispered words of comfort as his body failed, all while calculating how much money she would receive from his death. Albert trusted her completely, even as he died, believing that his wife was doing everything possible to save him. Albert Zimmerman died on November 3, 1906, but his death would be different from the others in one crucial way. Unknown to Margaret, Albert had been in correspondence with Thomas O'Sullivan's colleagues in Chicago. He had written them a letter, to be opened only in the event of his death, detailing his suspicions about Margaret and his fear that he was being poisoned. He had hidden the letter in his trunk, but had already mailed a copy to a lawyer in Cincinnati with instructions to forward it to the Chicago investigators if anything happened to him. Margaret discovered the hidden letter while going through Albert's belongings after his death. The realization that she had been exposed sent her into a panic. She burned the letter and any other documents she could find, but she knew it was too late. If Albert had written one letter, he had probably written others. She began making preparations to flee, converting her assets to cash and planning to disappear into the vast American frontier. But she had waited too long. The investigators from Chicago had already contacted the Indiana State Police, and they were closing in. On March 15, 1908, Sheriff William Patterson arrived at Margaret's farm with a warrant for her arrest. Margaret was in the pig pen when they found her, feeding the animals as she did every morning. She showed no emotion when Patterson read the charges against her, simply asked if she could finish feeding the pigs. Patterson, struck by her callousness, refused. As they led her away in shackles, the pigs began squealing, a sound that neighbors said could be heard for miles around. It was as if the animals knew that their regular feeding schedule had been permanently disrupted. The investigation that followed revealed the full extent of Margaret's crimes. Detective James Morrison from the state police spent weeks at the farm, bringing in experts to examine the property. They dug up the pig pens, finding human bone fragments that had been partially digested but were still identifiable. They found teeth, buttons, pieces of jewelry that had passed through the pigs' digestive systems. In Margaret's house, they discovered a hidden compartment containing detailed records of her crimes, including the insurance policies, forged letters, and most disturbingly, a journal where she had recorded the details of each murder with clinical precision. The journal was the most damning evidence against Margaret. In it, she had written about each husband with a cold detachment that shocked even hardened investigators. She described their final moments, the effectiveness of different poisons, the rate at which the pigs consumed the bodies. She had even rated each murder on various factors, like ease of execution, profit gained, and personal satisfaction. Thomas O'Sullivan's murder received her highest marks for satisfaction, though she noted that the manual nature of the killing had been more physically demanding than she preferred. The trial of Margaret Hoffmann began in September 1908 and became a national sensation. Newspapers from across the country sent reporters to cover what they called the trial of the century. The courtroom was packed every day with spectators eager to catch a glimpse of the woman who had turned her farm into a killing ground. Margaret sat through the proceedings with an expression of mild interest, as if she were watching a play that had nothing to do with her. She wore black, ostensibly in mourning for her deceased husbands, a detail that the press found particularly macabre. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence against Margaret. They brought in experts who testified about the bone fragments found on the property, chemists who had tested tissue samples from Albert Zimmerman's body and found massive amounts of arsenic, and handwriting experts who proved that the letters supposedly from Thomas O'Sullivan were forgeries. They read excerpts from Margaret's journal, causing several spectators to flee the courtroom in disgust. The prosecution painted a picture of a woman driven by greed and an insatiable appetite for murder, someone who had perverted the institution of marriage into a hunting ground. Margaret's defense attorney, a young public defender named William Carey, attempted to argue that Margaret was insane, that no woman in her right mind could commit such heinous acts. He brought in alienists, as psychologists were called then, who testified about female hysteria and the effects of childlessness on a woman's mental state. But Margaret undermined his efforts by her own behavior. She was calm, articulate, and clearly intelligent. When she took the stand in her own defense, she spoke clearly and rationally, though she denied all charges against her. The most shocking moment of the trial came when Margaret suddenly changed her plea. After 2 weeks of testimony, she stood up and announced that she wanted to confess. Her attorney tried to stop her, but Margaret insisted. Over the course of 3 days, she provided a detailed confession of all 6 murders, correcting the prosecution when they got details wrong and providing information about evidence they hadn't yet discovered. She showed no remorse, no emotion at all, simply reciting the facts as if describing a recipe or a farming technique. When asked why she had killed her husbands, Margaret's answer chilled the courtroom. She said that men were no different from the pigs she raised, greedy animals driven by base desires, who could be easily led to slaughter with the right bait. She said she felt no more guilt about killing them than she would about slaughtering a hog for market. The only difference, she noted, with what seemed like genuine puzzlement, was that society objected to one, but not the other. This statement caused such an uproar that the judge had to clear the courtroom. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all charges. Margaret received the death sentence, becoming one of the few women in Indiana history to be condemned to hang. The judge, in passing sentence, called her a monster who had violated every sacred trust, who had turned the sanctity of marriage into an abattoir. Margaret listened to his words with the same mild interest she had shown throughout the trial, seemingly unmoved by her fate. While awaiting execution, Margaret became something of a celebrity. Journalists tried to interview her. Psychologists wanted to study her, and she received hundreds of letters from people across the country. Some were from admirers, disturbed individuals who saw her as a hero who had struck back against male oppression. Others were from religious people trying to save her soul. Margaret ignored them all, spending her time writing what she called her memoirs. These writings, which were confiscated and later destroyed by authorities, allegedly contained details of other murders she had never been charged with, including several farmhands who had disappeared over the years, and at least 2 traveling salesmen who had made the mistake of stopping at her farm. On June 7, 1909, Margaret Hoffmann was led to the gallows. She had eaten a hearty breakfast of bacon and eggs, a detail that the press found particularly significant given her crimes. She walked to the scaffold without assistance, refusing the traditional hood because she wanted to see death coming. Her last words, spoken in German, were Die Schweine müssen gefüttert werden, which translates to the pigs must be fed. The execution was botched. Her neck didn't break cleanly, and she strangled slowly over the course of 13 minutes. Some saw this as divine justice, others as a final cruelty inflicted on a woman who, whatever her crimes, deserved a quick death. After Margaret's execution, authorities faced the problem of what to do with her farm. The property had become infamous, and no one wanted to buy it. The pigs, all 73 of them, were destroyed and burned, as local farmers refused to allow them to be sold for meat, fearing contamination from their unholy diet. The buildings were demolished, the wood burned, and the land was left fallow. Locals reported that nothing would grow properly on the land for years afterward, as if the soil itself had been poisoned by the evil that had taken place there. The impact of Margaret's crimes extended far beyond her execution. The insurance industry implemented new regulations requiring waiting periods and investigations before policies on spouses could be claimed. The concept of the Black Widow killer entered the American consciousness, a woman who marries and murders for profit. Law enforcement agencies began to pay more attention to patterns of spousal death, creating early versions of what would later become databases, tracking suspicious deaths across jurisdictions. The families of Margaret's victims faced not only the loss of their loved ones, but the horror of knowing what had happened to the bodies. Many couldn't bear to remain in Indiana and moved away, trying to escape the notoriety and trauma. The family of Eric and Niels Johnson was particularly devastated, having lost 2 sons to the same killer. Their elderly mother in Sweden never fully understood what had happened. dying still believing her sons had found happiness in America. In the years following the case, several copycat crimes were attempted by women inspired by Margaret's methods. None were as successful or as prolific, but the very fact that her crimes had inspired others added another layer of horror to her legacy. Law enforcement agencies began training officers to recognize the signs of Black Widow killers, creating profiles and warning signs that are still used today in modified forms. The psychological impact on the community where Margaret had lived was profound and lasting. Many people developed fears around food, particularly meat, that persisted for generations. Local butchers saw their business decline as people became suspicious of ground meat and sausages. Some families completely stopped eating pork, unable to forget what Margaret's pigs had consumed. The area where her farm had stood became known as a cursed place, and even decades later, children were warned not to play there. Modern forensic psychologists who have studied the case classify Margaret as one of America's first documented female serial killers who showed clear psychopathic traits. Her lack of empathy, her methodical planning, her ability to maintain a facade of normalcy while committing horrific crimes all point to a personality disorder that would have made her dangerous in any era. Some researchers have suggested that her early exposure to death and butchery in her father's shop may have desensitized her to violence, though this alone cannot explain her transformation into a killer. The question of what drove Margaret to kill has been debated for over a century. Was it purely greed, or was there something deeper, a hatred of men rooted in her experiences growing up in a patriarchal society where she was denied inheritance despite her years of work? Was it the thrill of power, the satisfaction of watching men who thought they were in control fall victim to her plans? Margaret herself never provided a satisfactory answer, seeming genuinely puzzled by the question of motivation. In her mind, the killings were simply practical solutions to the problem of acquiring wealth as a woman with limited options. The method Margaret chose for disposing of bodies, feeding them to pigs, has become infamous in criminal history. Pigs are omnivores, capable of consuming almost anything, including bones, and Margaret's training of specific pigs to consume human flesh showed a level of planning that was unusual for the era. Modern criminal investigators still study her methods as an example of how killers attempt to destroy evidence. The fact that she was ultimately caught despite her careful planning serves as a reminder that no crime is perfect. One of the most disturbing aspects of Margaret's crimes was how she perverted institutions and relationships that society considers sacred. Marriage, which should be based on love and trust, became a trap. The home, which should be a place of safety, became a killing ground. Even the farm animals, innocent creatures, were turned into unwitting accomplices in her crimes. This corruption of the ordinary and familiar into something horrific is part of what makes her story so unsettling even to today. The legal precedent set by Margaret's case influenced American criminal law for decades. Her trial established procedures for dealing with serial killers that would be refined and used in later cases. The use of forensic evidence, particularly the analysis of bone fragments and poison residues, was innovative for the time and paved the way for more scientific approaches to criminal investigation. The case also highlighted the need for better communication between jurisdictions, as Margaret had been able to operate for so long, partly because there was no effective way to track patterns of crime across state lines. In the decades following her execution, Margaret Hoffmann became a figure of dark folklore. Stories about her grew and mutated with each telling, some claiming she had killed dozens more than the 6 husbands she was convicted of murdering. Ghost stories emerged about her farm, with locals claiming to hear pig squeals on quiet nights, even years after the animals had been destroyed. Some said Margaret's spirit still wandered the land, looking for new victims to feed the phantom pigs that existed only in the space between life and death. The truth about Margaret Hoffmann is perhaps more disturbing than any ghost story. She was not a monster from a fairy tale, but a human being who chose to commit monstrous acts. She walked among her neighbors, attended church, participated in community events, all while harboring deadly secrets. Her ability to maintain this double life for so long raises uncomfortable questions about how well we really know the people around us and how much evil can hide behind a facade of normalcy. The impact of Margaret's crimes on the institution of marriage itself cannot be understated. Her case contributed to changing attitudes about marriage in the early 20th century, particularly around the idea that women should be wholly dependent on their husbands. The fact that Margaret had used marriage as a weapon highlighted the vulnerability of both parties in a relationship where one person holds all the legal and financial power. Some historians argue that her case, along with others like it, contributed to gradual reforms in marriage laws that gave women more rights and protections. Modern true crime researchers have attempted to trace potential additional victims of Margaret Hoffmann. By examining missing person records from the period and comparing them to Margaret's movements and activities, they have identified at least a dozen other possible victims. These include traveling salesmen who were known to have visited the area around her farm and then disappeared, as well as seasonal workers who had been employed on neighboring farms and were last seen in Margaret's company. The true extent of her crimes may never be known. The farmhouse where Margaret lived and killed was eventually torn down in the 1920s, but archaeological excavations of the site in the 1970s revealed additional bone fragments that had been missed in the original investigation. These fragments, analyzed using modern techniques, confirmed that at least 3 additional individuals had died on the property, though they could not be identified. This discovery reignited interest in the case and led to new investigations that, while unable to identify the victims, did provide more insight into Margaret's methods. One aspect of the case that has fascinated researchers is Margaret's journal, portions of which survived despite attempts to destroy it. In entries that weren't related to her crimes, Margaret wrote about her daily life with a surprising degree of introspection. She wrote about her childhood, her father's butcher shop, the death of her mother, and her feelings of injustice when her brothers inherited the family business. These entries provide a window into the mind of a killer, showing someone who felt perpetually wronged by the world and who had decided to take what she felt she was owed by any means necessary. The role of the pigs in Margaret's crimes has become a subject of both horror and scientific interest. Researchers have studied how she trained the animals to consume human flesh, gradually acclimating them to the taste and texture. The fact that pigs will eat almost anything, including their own dead, made them perfect accomplices for body disposal. Margaret's innovation was in recognizing this and systematically training specific groups of pigs for this purpose. The psychological effect on the community of knowing that local pork might have come from pigs that had fed on human remains created a lasting trauma that affected dietary habits for generations. The investigation techniques used to catch Margaret were primitive by today's standards, but innovative for their time. The use of chemical analysis to detect arsenic in Albert Zimmerman's remains, the examination of bone fragments to determine their origin, and the handwriting analysis that proved the letters from Thomas O'Sullivan were forged all represented cutting-edge forensic science in 1908. The case became a textbook example for training investigators and contributed to the development of forensic science as a discipline. Margaret's execution and the publicity surrounding it had unintended consequences. While it was meant to serve as a deterrent, it also inspired a wave of similar crimes. In the 5 years following her execution, there were at least 7 cases of women attempting to poison their husbands for insurance money, with several explicitly citing Margaret's case as inspiration. This led to a moral panic about Black Widow killers that resulted in increased scrutiny of any woman whose husband died unexpectedly, sometimes leading to false accusations and wrongful prosecutions. The question of whether Margaret was legally sane at the time of her crimes continues to be debated. By modern standards, her clear psychopathic traits and possible personality disorders might have resulted in a different verdict. But in 1908, the legal definition of insanity was much narrower, requiring that the defendant not know the difference between right and wrong. Margaret clearly knew her actions were wrong in the eyes of the law, as evidenced by her elaborate efforts to conceal them, so she was judged sane and fully responsible for her crimes. The economic impact of Margaret's crimes on her community was significant. Property values in the area plummeted as the region became associated with the murders. The local pork industry, which had been thriving, saw a dramatic decline as consumers refused to buy meat from farms anywhere near where Margaret had operated. Several farming families were forced to relocate, unable to sell their properties or products. The economic depression in the area lasted for years, a hidden cost of Margaret's crimes that affected many innocent people. In recent years, feminist scholars have examined Margaret's case through the lens of gender studies, arguing that, while her crimes were heinous, they must be understood in the context of the limited options available to women in the late 19th century. Unable to inherit her father's business, unable to own property in her own name until she was widowed, Margaret turned to the only avenue she saw for acquiring wealth and independence. This analysis doesn't excuse her crimes, but attempts to understand the social conditions that might contribute to such extreme actions. The preservation of evidence from Margaret's case has proved valuable for modern forensic scientists. Hair and tissue samples preserved from the investigation have been reanalyzed using contemporary techniques, revealing details that weren't accessible to investigators in 1908. These analyses have confirmed the presence of multiple poisons in some samples, suggesting that Margaret may have experimented with different combinations to achieve desired effects. This evidence has been used to train modern forensic toxicologists in detecting historical poisoning cases. The story of Margaret Hoffmann has been adapted into numerous works of fiction, though none have fully captured the horror of the real events. Writers and filmmakers have been drawn to the dramatic elements of her story, the Black Widow aspect, the use of pigs for body disposal, the corruption of rural American values. But most adaptations have softened or sensationalized the truth. The real Margaret was neither a misunderstood victim nor a cackling villain, but something more disturbing, a calm, rational woman who had decided that murder was simply a practical solution to her problems. Today, the area where Margaret's farm once stood shows no trace of the horrors that occurred there. A shopping center covers the land, with stores and restaurants serving the local community. Most people who shop there have no idea of the history beneath their feet. But occasionally, construction workers digging in the area still find bone fragments, small reminders of the woman who turned her farm into a graveyard and her pigs into accomplices. These discoveries are no longer investigated, the victims being too long dead to identify, but they serve as archaeological evidence of one of America's most disturbing serial killers. The case of Margaret Hoffmann forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature and the capacity for evil that exists in seemingly ordinary people. She wasn't born a monster, but became one through a combination of circumstances, choices, and perhaps inherent personality traits that would have made her dangerous in any situation. Her story reminds us that the people who do the most harm aren't always obvious villains, but can be those who present themselves as pillars of the community, those who know how to play the role society expects of them while harboring dark secrets. The legacy of Margaret's crimes extends beyond the immediate victims and their families. Every woman who was suspected of poisoning her husband in the following decades, whether guilty or innocent, was compared to Margaret. Every mysterious disappearance of a traveling man raised questions about whether another Margaret was operating somewhere. The case created a template for a type of crime that society had to learn to recognize and prevent. In this way, Margaret's impact on American criminal justice continues to this day. The psychological profile of Margaret Hoffmann has become a standard case study in criminology courses. Her combination of psychopathic traits, including lack of empathy, superficial charm, manipulativeness, and absence of remorse, along with her methodical planning and ability to maintain a normal facade, makes her a textbook example of a certain type of serial killer. Students studying criminal psychology learn about her case as an example of how someone can completely lack normal human emotional responses while still functioning in society. One of the most chilling aspects of Margaret's story is how close she came to never being caught. If Albert Zimmerman hadn't written his letter, if Thomas O'Sullivan hadn't documented his suspicions, Margaret might have continued killing indefinitely. She had perfected her method, established her cover story, and had the community's sympathy as a repeatedly widowed woman. It was only the accumulation of small mistakes and the persistence of investigators that finally exposed her. This near miss serves as a warning about how many crimes might go undetected, especially in eras before modern forensic science and communication technology. The question of how many women like Margaret operated in the late 19th and early 20th centuries is impossible to answer. The combination of limited investigation techniques, poor communication between jurisdictions, and social assumptions that women weren't capable of such crimes means that many similar cases might have gone undetected. Margaret herself suggested in her destroyed memoirs that she knew of other women who had eliminated unwanted husbands, though whether this was truth or fantasy is unknown. The possibility that she was part of a larger, hidden phenomenon adds another layer of horror to her already disturbing story. As we look back on the case of Margaret Hoffmann more than a century later, it serves as a reminder of the human capacity for evil and the importance of justice. 6 men died horrible deaths, trusting a woman who saw them only as sources of income. Their families were left to grieve without even bodies to bury, knowing their loved ones had been reduced to pig feed. The community was traumatized in ways that lasted generations. And yet, through the persistence of investigators and the courage of witnesses, Margaret was stopped and brought to justice. The story of the woman who fed her 6 husbands to her pigs remains one of the most disturbing chapters in American criminal history. Not because of its sensational elements, though those are certainly horrifying, but because of what it reveals about the potential for evil that exists in ordinary settings. Margaret Hoffmann wasn't a creature from a nightmare, but a woman who lived among her neighbors, who participated in church socials, who seemed like just another hard-working farmer trying to make a living. The fact that such evil can hide behind such an ordinary facade is perhaps the most terrifying aspect of her story. If this investigation into one of history's most disturbing killers has intrigued you, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell for more deep dives into true crime's darkest cases. Let me know in the comments if you've heard of similar cases in your area, or if there are other historical crimes you'd like us to investigate. Remember, the most dangerous predators are often those who appear the most harmless, those who know how to blend in and gain our trust before revealing their true nature. Stay safe, stay aware, and keep questioning the stories history tells us.